Ethics, Lecture 7 on David Hume. David Hume's moral philosophy is best seen as being a contrast with almost everything we've talked about so far. Everything we've talked about so far has placed reason basically at the centerpiece of moral philosophy. For Plato, for example, in order to be rational and just, we need to use the rational part of the soul to get to the point where we can understand the truth of justice. For Aristotle, it's the rational part of us that makes us uniquely human. It's the part that makes the best and right decisions, and it's therefore the part that enables us to live the just or good life. And then Kant as well is precisely because we are a rational being that we are a person. So in most of the cases that we've looked at so far, in fact all of the cases, with perhaps the exception of Mill, who was very influenced by Hume, reason is the primary determinant of what is or is not moral. Hume is going to challenge this long-standing belief in moral philosophy, and he's going to argue that it is rather sentiment or taste that is going to be what determines right from wrong. So what we're going to talk about in this lecture then is what this means and what the implications of this will be. First off, what Hume means by interest is that we have to have some sort of concern, passion, or interest for something to be able to make a judgment about it. In other words, for Hume, what reason does is that reason simply gives us the facts. It tells us what is the case or how to get from point A to point B. It doesn't tell us what ought to be the case. This is a famous distinction in moral philosophy, the distinction between ought and is. I can say, for example, that you are a certain height, that you are male or female, that you are in Louisiana as you read this. That's very different from saying you ought to do this or you ought to be that. Factual matters, whether are a matter of amoral judgments. You're simply describing what is the case as opposed to what ought to be the case. So take an example from politics. We could say that the top 1% of American society control 40% of the wealth of American society. That number may not be right, but for the sake of argument, just to say it is the fact. You can look it up, but there is a factual matter about what the top 1% of American society controls in terms of wealth. Well, that's a fact. The moral judgment is whether it ought to be that way or not. And it's when you get into the moral discussion where the debates begin to rage. We've already seen this earlier with the Plato lecture in the Republic. Actually, this was the Euthyphro, very first lecture. When Socrates asked, what is it that the gods argue about? They don't argue about facts or how many chairs are in a room or who is the tallest person in the class. Those are simple matters of fact that one can resolve. What people argue about are values, the way things ought to be. So if someone is taken to be a bad person, then the implication is that they ought not to be that way. And that's where arguments come in, and that's where values come in. Well, according to Hume, the only way values enter the picture is when we have an interest in something attaining. If you were to discover that a particular stock collapsed and on word that the company was going bankrupt, that fact probably wouldn't be either good or bad for you. You would be indifferent to it unless you happen to have your entire life savings invested in that particular stock. Then, of course, you would have a very strong interest in that fact, and that would indeed be a terrible or bad thing. Similarly, it would be a very good thing if it got great news and it tripled in value overnight. That would then be a very good thing for you. So the idea here for Hume is that in order to get someone motivated to do something right or to get them not to do something wrong, you have to stoke their interests. So as Hume argues in the reading, when ministers stand in the pulpit and they're trying to get someone to do the right thing, they will often describe unsavory characters and so on and so forth. But what they're really trying to do is they're trying to get you motivated or interested in continuing to do the right thing or in doing the right thing. To take one other example, if you were working at a suicide hotline and someone were to call in and they were suicidal, you wouldn't simply tell them the facts about, well, yes, if you jump off that bridge, you will kill yourself. They know that, of course. That's precisely why they're on the bridge, let's say. What you would try to do would be to try to stoke their interest in continuing to live. You might try to ask if they have children or any of a number of other things that they can hang their hat on as something that they would have an interest in that would then motivate them to continue living. So for Hume, then, it's our passions and interests that ultimately determine what we do and what we consider moral or not moral. Reason does not. Reason simply gives us the facts, the way things are. It doesn't tell us how things ought to be. So with Hume, then, we have this very, very strong distinction between facts and values. So with that in place, then, what Hume does in his moral philosophy is in large part an extension of what he does in his regular philosophy. And in his regular philosophy, his philosophy of mind and metaphysics, he has this notion of what he calls the association of ideas. And the idea for Hume is he doesn't want to simply assume the way things are. He wants to give an account or explanation for why things are the way they are. And when it comes to moral philosophy, or when it comes to philosophy in general, or the judgments we make about the world, they're in large part a consequence of things we think and what we say about things. And what Hume argues is that there are three primary ways in which our thoughts come to be connected with one another. And this will be important because this will lay the foundation for how Hume goes about analyzing and thinking about moral matters. The first way in which Hume thinks that our ideas are linked together, well, let me just give a brief example to show why Hume thinks there's a logic here. If you're in a conversation with someone, and after an extended period of time of conversation, you get to the point where you say, how did we end up talking about this? It wouldn't be completely random. There would be a logic to how you got there. And you could, if you wanted to, go back and trace through the conversation. Let's say it was recorded, and you could see that there was a natural logical progression from one point to the next. And Hume, by reflection and observation, boils this logic down to three basic principles that he calls the association of ideas. The first one is the principle of resemblance. As you can see in the slide, the picture on this slide, if you were to simply see the picture on the right, you would automatically think of Obama because of the resemblance between them. Now, if you see Obama, you're not going to think of the person on the right because you're more familiar with Obama than you are the person on the right. If you had never known who Obama was, and I think the person on the right is someone from Indonesia, then the person on the right wouldn't get you to think of Obama. So what happens is that something that you're already familiar with, when something new comes along, our standard way of associating it is with something that we are already familiar with. And one way we do that is through resemblance. So again, if you looked at the picture on the right, you would automatically think of something you're already familiar with by association and resemblance. And the resemblance with Obama is obviously very, very clear. So that's the first one. So as you're carrying on a conversation, you're talking about one person, and that person might look like or resemble someone else, and that leads you to talk about that other person. The second form of association is what Hume calls contiguity, which basically means one thing is regularly associated with something else. So if I were to say Tweedledee and, you would think Tweedledum. If I were to say Beavis and, you would say Butthead. If I were to say Sonny and, you would say Cher. This is an example of contiguity. In other words, whenever we've heard of one, we've most frequently associated it with the other. Now, in a culture that has never heard of Beavis and Butthead, if I were to say Beavis and, they wouldn't know what to think. They wouldn't associate it with anything. But I'm sure they have their own associations of ideas by contiguity. So that's the other way in which our ideas are connected one to the other. And finally, the third is cause and effect. If we see smoke, we're going to think and assume that there is fire. And this is, again, something that we acquire through experience. And this last point is important because for Hume, we don't learn about cause and effect a priori. What that means is we don't learn about it by reason alone. We learn about cause and effect relations by way of experience. Experience is what tells us that snow is cold, that snow and ice will make things cold. Without any experience of ice or snow, we wouldn't know what it is or what its causal relations are. So again, for Hume, everything we know through experience. And then through these association of ideas based on experience, we accumulate over time a stockpile of beliefs and ideas about how the world works and how we expect things to work, and so on and so forth. So this is going to basically provide the foundation for what Hume is going to do as he begins to look at ethical matters. Another related issue for Hume is the distinction between induction and deduction. Now, as Hume will argue, the standard method in philosophy had been the deductive method. In other words, the desire and the hope had been to come up with some universal principle or truth from which one can then take a particular instance that is an example of that universal truth and make and draw some certain conclusions from it. So an example, classic example, would be all men are mortal. So that's a universal claim, right? All. Whenever we hear something like all, every, none, etc., that's an example of a universal claim. So if all men are mortal, and then we take Socrates as a man, as a particular instance, we can then deduce that Socrates is therefore mortal. We could therefore go on and make other conclusions. I am a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, I am mortal. That's the ideal approach in philosophy, as Hume points out, because it gives us certainty. But it's a certainty based on the truth of the premises. So if it were to turn out that the universal premise isn't certain or true, then we wouldn't end up with certainty in the conclusion. Right, if I say all men are penguins, then clearly I can't say Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is a penguin, because that premise is false. So the question then is, how do we get to know these universal premises in the first place? As we've already seen with Socrates, his desire was to get to a universal truth of piety or holiness, for example, in the Euthyphro. Remember, he didn't want just examples of piety or holiness. He wanted Euthyphro to give him the one universal truth that all examples of holiness had in common, or that made all examples of holiness holy. That's an example of the deductive method. In other words, Socrates wanted the universal truth from which he could then deduce particular truths. And there was good reason he wanted that, if you'll remember. He was on his way to his own self-defense at trial, and if he could get that universal truth, he could then use it in his own defense. But as we saw then, and as we saw again in the Republic, those universal truths were never ultimately arrived at. And yet the belief was that they are ultimately there, and through the Socratic method we would eventually find them. Hume argues to the contrary, that all our knowledge, and including the knowledge of claims we take to be universal, are the result of an inductive generalization. By inductive generalization, I simply mean that we take a bunch of particular instances and we generalize over them. Let's say I show up to class 5 minutes late every day. You're going to get to the point where you're going to come up with a type of statement. Well, Professor Bell is always late, right? There's a kind of universal statement. Always. How did you get to that sort of generalized quasi-universal statement? Through inductive generalization. The problem with inductive generalizations is that they don't give us certainty. I may actually one day show up early. And this is why Hume ultimately ends up being a skeptic. Because according to Hume, everything we know through experience, the association of ideas, and an inductive generalization. And the one thing that this inductive generalization cannot give us is knowledge about the future. We can't be certain that the future will continue to be the way it has been in the past. All we can use the past for is to give us probabilities and likelihoods that things will turn out certain ways. So certainly one can have a reasonable belief about how things will turn out, but they can't have a certain belief about how things will turn out. And so Hume's approach basically ends up with skepticism. Now this leads us to another important issue or question for Hume, because in its extreme form, one could say that we can't even know what cause and effect will be. In other words, we can't know, for example, in the picture on this slide, when someone shoots a billiard ball to break in pool, we have a pretty good expectation of what's likely going to happen. The balls are going to scatter in a way that is somewhat predictable. It's even more predictable if it's a single shot, right? If you're going for an 8-ball in the corner pocket, let's say, you know if you hit it at a certain angle, it'll go in a certain direction. How do we come to those types of expectations? And it's a kind of cause and effect expectation or belief that we have. For Hume, it's merely a matter of custom and or habit that we come to this belief, and it's not certain. In other words, it's repeated experiences over time that has led us to this custom or habit. So this is where Hume is different from what's referred to in philosophical tradition as Pyrrhonian skepticism. Pyrrhonian skepticism comes from Pyrrho, who was a great Greek philosopher and a skeptic, and he argued that by a series of arguments, some of which Hume uses and Descartes uses some of them as well, that we can't know anything with certainty. And since we can't know anything with certainty, we should refrain from judgment because we may be wrong. And so the problem with this view from Hume's perspective is that we can't help but believe things. In other words, we can't go through life refraining from judgment. We have to make judgment. We can't help it. We are going to expect that ball to go in the corner pocket if we shoot it in the right way. We can't refrain from judgment in these matters. We get out of the way of an oncoming car because we believe it would hurt us if we didn't. Those are the types of beliefs that we can't help but have. And what experience shows us is that they are indeed reasonable beliefs to have, because experience supports those beliefs. Association of ideas, accumulation of experience, custom and habit all lead us to have a certain set of beliefs, and some beliefs are going to be more reasonable than others. Other beliefs, however, will not be reasonable, and this is where Hume comes down hard on superstition. Because superstition, according to Hume, is often a belief that is pounded into people without any foundation in experience, without any evidence, etc., to support it. And yet the belief in it is something that is foundational for many people's lives. He gives the example of the Eucharist as one example, or not eating meat on Fridays, or believing that if you walk under a ladder you'll have 7 years bad luck, or those types of beliefs that people have. They have no empirical support whatsoever, and yet many people's lives are fundamentally centered upon or structured by these beliefs. And that's where Hume thinks that it can be a detriment, especially if it hinders our ability to think about the world, to question the world, and to learn more about what's going on. So with this in mind, then, we can now return to Hume's moral discussions. And in the readings, he focuses on two main issues. And since I just talked about superstition, let me talk about justice and superstition. Now, justice is, in the context of Hume's essay, or long essay, is property rights. He's not talking about justice in the courtrooms or anything like that. He's talking basically about property rights when he's talking about justice. And on the one hand, justice seems to be something, or property rights seem to be something that is very similar to superstition. In other words, on a Friday you can't eat meat, but the other day you can. One person can't eat pork, another person can. One person doesn't eat meat because it will give them bad karma. For another person, it's perfectly fine to eat meat. One person can't drink wine, another person can. We'll have a bunch of these types of beliefs, that appear to have no empirical basis for the differences that are made. But similarly, if I cross this fence, the picture that you have here on the right, if I were to go beyond that fence, suddenly I would be a lawbreaker and I could be arrested. But what's the difference between the grassy field beyond the fence and what's likely the grassy field before it? In other words, or to take yet another example, if I have a grove of apple trees in my backyard and I pick the apples from my tree, but then venture over into my neighbor's yard and pick his apples too, by venturing those few feet across into his property, I have now done something wrong by picking his apples. What is going on there that there doesn't seem to be any real difference in the apples themselves? What's going on? Well, is it superstition? Hume says no, and the reason not is because he argues, and this is key, that society itself benefits from property rights. So in other words, justice is necessary and not a superstition because society itself is dependent upon it. And that's what distinguishes justice as a virtue from a superstition. A superstition is something he takes to be idle and not necessary for the benefit of society. Now, one could argue that certain beliefs, certain religious beliefs or other beliefs, for example, are necessary for the benefit of society, then they would fall into the category of virtues. If they are not necessary for the benefit of society, and in many cases, Hume argues that they are detrimental because they produce dogmatism and closed-mindedness, then they aren't virtues. They were superstitions, or well, I suppose one could even say vices. So this is why justice then is a virtue, because it's necessary for the benefit of society. And the same is true for the other virtue that he looks at, and actually he looks at benevolence before he looks at justice. But since I was talking about superstition, it was good to talk about justice first. But in the context of talking about benevolence, he even goes on, and Hume goes on and explicitly says that what it is about benevolence, being kind, forgiving, a benevolent person or leader, etc., what is especially good about those, or what those actions have in common that lead people to praise them, is that they are beneficial to society. Okay? So it's not just ourselves that benefits from benevolence or justice, it's society as a whole. And this is one area where Hume is very different from other philosophers, like Thrasymachus, for example, where we are just out for ourselves. Hobbes was the more contemporary example that Hume had in mind, but the basic idea here for Hume is that, yes, we are individuals with strong self-interest, but we are always and always have been part of a society. This is where he's kind of like Aristotle. Now, we are social animals, and we are always in a social context. So it's not surprising then, and to be expected, that we should praise actions that are beneficial to society, because they are as instrumental to our well-being as things that are good to us. You know, Hume does recognize that our individual self-interest can be stronger and more strongly felt than our interest in the well-being of others. But that's where education comes in. That's where the more we learn and know about the importance of society and living in society, the more we will come to praise the behaviors that are beneficial and good to society. And that's where the social virtues such as justice and benevolence come in. The final theme I want to talk about with Hume is to kind of get back to where we started with this notion of sentiment or interest versus reason. Some might argue, well, if virtue and right and wrong are dependent upon a certain interest that we have, then it would seem to be that we open the door for moral or ethical relativism. In other words, right and wrong is simply what I happen to think it is. Well, that's not the case for Hume. In other words, we don't end up with relativism. And we've already seen some of the reasons why, but it's now important to make it explicit. The main reason why we don't end up with relativism is that we all share the same basic human nature. We are all social by human nature, and we all have basically the same human fabric and constitution. And so as a result, one would expect that we share many fundamental interests and passions in common. So rather than thinking that basing ethics on interest and passion, we're going to end up with a chaos of different moral judgments, we won't. Because we share the same human nature, we will have a moral sentiment that we largely have in common. And it's this moral sentiment or interest that guides us towards the social virtues that we have been looking at. And education and experience are important in this context because without education and experience, our natural human nature and capacity for moral sentiment will not be won't be provoked, or it won't be instilled within us. It's kind of like someone who's never exposed to language at a critical period in their young lives, never really acquire the full capacity to speak language. But if we are exposed to language from early on, we naturally pick it up ourselves. Similarly, if we are naturally exposed to tolerance, to justice, to benevolence, to virtues, we naturally pick it up on our own. And as we grow older and begin to think more about the relationships between our virtues and society, we also then come to recognize how good it is for society as well that these virtues be instilled. So there's a similarity to Aristotle. If you'll recall that for Aristotle, when we are young, we are brought up by parents to have certain habits and to do certain things. And as we get older, we acquire the intellectual virtue that enables us to grasp why what we're doing is the right thing. The difference here for Hume is that Hume is focusing on human nature and is bringing in this whole theory of ideas, the association of ideas, custom and habit, and all those other things that we've talked about in order to kind of lay out his theory of moral sentiment and basically his theory of what determines right from wrong. And again, it's not reason that determines right from wrong, but it's a basic moral sentiment that we all share by human nature. And the final point for Hume is that toleration is important for Hume. And this follows from the skepticism that we spoke of a few slides ago. If we can't know anything with absolute certainty, but can know things by a certain degree of reasonableness, we can certainly encourage someone to not act in an unreasonable way, but we can't be certain that today's unreasonable belief might not be tomorrow's common sense belief either. And since we can't be certain, we need to be tolerant of other people's beliefs, within reason, of course. If they're going to be harmful and other things like that, then we need to be on our defensive and protect ourselves and others from that. But in a context where some of these unreasonable beliefs are harmless and may very well prove to be common sense beliefs of the future, then toleration is very much the operative way to live, according to Hume. So this is, in sort of a short summary, David Hume's moral philosophy.